This is the FX30. It has a bunch of buttons, most of which are customizable. So let's go through how I have it set up. Now, one of the unique things about the FX30 and I assume the FX3, they're a little different when it comes to the default mode for exposure. Now you can select the normal PASM modes, but then the default is actually flexible, where your adjustment for ISO, aperture, and shutter speed can either be manual, and then if you hold the designated button, it'll switch over to automatic. And then that particular setting will be adjusted automatically, which is nice compared to, say, putting it in aperture priority or shutter priority or manual, and then you don't have that sort of control. I haven't used that setting. It does seem good in theory, but I've just been shooting manual for literally everything. So I have changed some of the functions of some of the buttons, because if you're not using that flexible exposure mode, they don't work the same. Now let's start with the dials. I have the front dial set to aperture, which is pretty standard on most cameras with two dials like this. The back dial I have set to shutter speed, mainly because I very rarely adjust shutter speed because, 180-degree shutter rule. And I have separate modes for different frame rates, so I usually don't have to change shutter speed at all. So basically this is the hardest to accidentally change. That's my reasoning, and it's also just sort of like the standard, so it's what I'm used to at least. And then the third dial, which is the D-pad, it is also a dial. I have that set to ISO, and because I shoot in Cine EI, it's not really ISO, it's EI, which is different. And I did sort of explain that in my video about Cine EI and S-Log3, but basically it won't change the actual exposure, it'll just change which stops are taking priority when it comes to highlights and shadows based on the base ISO that you're already on, because in Cine EI you only have the option between the two base ISOs, and then you can adjust your EI within that, but that doesn't change the exposure itself. So that's the dials, pretty straightforward. Now with the buttons, we're gonna go up in number because that makes sense. Number one, it says next to it iris, so by default it is an aperture control where you press it, then you can adjust your aperture. But since I already have a dial already on that, and most of my lenses except for this one and the one I'm using, but those two back there, they have physical aperture rings, so I just use that when I'm using them. But I don't need this to be an aperture control, so I have it set to stabilization mode. So I shoot most stuff in standard stabilization, which is the regular IBIS of mechanically moving the sensor. But if I do want to, for some reason, turn that off or turn on active stabilization, I can do that very easily. One button and then just select up or down which mode you want. Number two, default to white balance. I've left that on white balance. So press that and then I can select either the white balance mode, but I basically keep it at 5600 all the time. So if I do want to change the temperature, I could just press that once and then I can adjust the temperature, but I basically never do. Number three is ISO. Now, what this would normally do is you press it and then you can adjust your ISO, but because I have it set to a dial, I don't need to press a button to adjust it. So I have it to switch base ISO. And like I said, because I'm shooting in Cine EI, I can't actually change my ISO like that anyway. So what I have it set to is switch base ISO. So if I press that button, it'll switch between 800 and 2500 because those are the two native ISOs on the FX30. Moving down to the back to number four, we have the delete button in the menus. I have that set to audio level. Now, sometimes when I'm using this camera, that'll work exactly as I need to. If I need to adjust the audio level, maybe I'm using a different mic, or if I change the settings on my VideoMic Pro Plus, or if I'm using my Wireless Go 2, depending on what mic I'm using and what the situation is, maybe I'll change the audio levels. But if I'm using the audio handle, which is actually on top of the SM4 right now, it's kind of janky, but it works. If you have the audio handle on, this does nothing because all of the controls are physically on the handle. But it is good to just be able to access that when I do need it. Moving on to number five, default is focus magnification. I kept it on that. This is mainly useful for when you're manual focusing. If you want to zoom in a lot onto what you're trying to focus on, it can be really handy. Even though I do have peaking on most of the time, it is good to be able to zoom in if you do need it. Speaking of peaking, on the right, we have the button labeled peaking. I have that still set on that, so I click right, it'll turn peaking on or off. Same with the zebras on the left, because now that I shoot in S-Log3, it's a lot more useful. I have my zebras set to, I think, 93 on this as a lower limit, and if I need to switch them off for whatever reason, I can. Not that I really want to, because I kind of don't really want to see the zebras, but if I have to have something overexposed, for example, and there are zebras and I want to get rid of them for the sake of looking at it, then I can do that. And then the one that I have changed is down, which is default to shutter, but because I have that mapped straight to a dial, I don't need that. So down for me will actually just switch between the regular movie shooting mode to S&Q mode, which is a lot quicker than going into the mode menu and then going up to S&Q mode. Because I have my 3 custom modes set to regular movie modes at different frame rates, if I want to shoot S&Q, I can just press down rather than going into the menu and all the way there. I also usually don't shoot in higher frame rates unless I'm shooting in S&Q mode, because if I know I want slow-mo, I'll just shoot it in slow-mo. I don't know if that's lazy, but it's easy. And then the final numbered custom button, actually right on the front, I'll move this so you can actually see it, is the record button right here. Now, it is by default set to record, and I leave it that way because I really like having 3 record buttons on this camera. It's very handy to be able to press record from the front, and also with the tally lights, you can see that it's recording. So I leave that as record. Speaking of record, we have the other record button on the top. Again, I leave that as record because I like having the options. It also lights up, so it kind of makes sense and it's satisfying to press the record button and then the record button light up. And then the last customizable button is the joystick here, which, you know, usually just works as a joystick, but if you click it in, it is set by default to focus standard, which is basically the same as if you were, say, in photo mode and you half press the shutter. It'll just focus on whatever's in the center of the screen, which can be good if you're in autofocus and it's focusing on something at the edge of the frame and you want to focus in the middle. I also couldn't really think of anything else to set that as, so I have that set on both of my cameras as the same thing. And because all of the lenses that I have for my Sony cameras have a custom button on the side, or in the case of that 7200 I have them set to face priority autofocus on or off. So if I want to focus on a face, then I'll click that on, it'll, no matter if there is a face in frame, it'll focus on it. But if I want to, say, focus on a product that I'm holding like this, as you can see, it's still focusing on my face. But if I turned priority off, it would focus on the camera here. So it can be useful if you're doing product sort of stuff, where if you're gonna hold stuff up, you don't have to worry about covering your face, so it focuses on the product like that. And the last customizable thing on this camera is the zoom rocker, which is around the shutter button. And I basically never use this because I don't have any power zoom lenses and I'm not gonna digitally zoom. So I do have it set to clear image zoom, but clear image zoom is not ideal. It's pretty good, but it's not ideal, and I rarely have a reason to use it because that's what the zoom lenses are for. So I have it set to clear image zoom, but I don't really use it. And then obviously the ones that you can't change, obviously there's the mode, the menu, and the function menu buttons. You can't change them. And then the up on the D-pad as well, you can't change. That is by default set to display, and that's all it does. And it'll just scroll through the display modes, which you can choose which ones will show up. And I actually use this a lot because when I'm shooting in S-Log3, I like to be able to see the histogram, or if I'm setting up a tripod and I want to make sure the camera is level, I will set it to the mode where you can see the level of the camera. So I use that one a lot. The one thing I forgot to mention was the center button of the D-pad. Actually, I have set to grid lines. So as you can see there, it just turns on and off the grid lines. Because sometimes you don't actually want them on, they're in the way, but other times you do. So back to past me. And one of the things I really like about the FX30 and basically the newer Sony cameras, because they all have this now, is this main menu, which has most of what you'll need in a nice layout where you can go through and select pretty much anything. And then, like most of the other Sony cameras, you also have your My menu settings. I have a few extra things that aren't in those original settings. In there, I have the audio set for the top handle, because that is a different setting, so I have that easily accessible. I have airplane mode on or off because I usually leave airplane mode on so it doesn't use extra battery by leaving Bluetooth and Wi-Fi on. And then if I need to connect it to my phone, for example, then I'll turn that off so I can connect it to the app. I've got my HDMI info display in case I want to display the info via HDMI. HDMI output settings and S&Q settings, because if I do want to switch to S&Q mode, I can then change whether I'm shooting between 50 or 100 frames per second or 1080p and 4K. because I can't have 3 custom settings in S&Q mode like I can on the A7 IV. They've also got things like monitor brightness and the custom key and dial set. So if I need to quickly change settings or set a new button as a new function, then I can do that and I don't have to scroll all the way down to where the actual setting is in the menus. And I also have format readily available there, but it was in the main menu, so I don't really need that. So those are my custom button settings and menu settings for the FX30. Anything weird there? Or anything you hadn't thought of before? If so, let me know. Go watch that video and do the other things. See you next time. Okay, bye.